This is Crave News Money with Kent Emmons.
When a state and local government tries to stifle your constitutional rights, who stands up for you? The Goldwater Institute. A lot of people have never heard of the Goldwater Institute, but almost everyone has benefited from what they do for us every single day. Defending our free speech, property rights, and even the rights of terminally ill patients to try new treatments who before Goldwater's bold action were prohibited from doing so. One of the most pressing issues in America right now is the government taking away your right to work as an independent contractor. From Uber drivers to kids mowing yards, listen up. What started as recently enacted California Assembly Bill 5, this movement is now sweeping across America like an opportunity-killing cancer. Joining me to discuss AB5 and defending your rights is attorney and Goldwater Institute's Vice President of Litigation, Tim Sandefur. Tim, it's great to have you with us. The Goldwater Institute does some amazing work, including what they're doing on the AB5. But before we go into that, a lot of people don't really realize exactly what the Goldwater Institute does and also how it affects them in their daily life. People like, common folks like you and I. Let's talk about that a little bit. What exactly is the Goldwater Institute?
So the Goldwater Institute is a nonprofit policy organization devoted to developing and advocating for free market policies and policies that are designed to expand people's freedom. Now, a lot of time people use the term think tank, but we prefer to think of ourselves more like an action tank, because we develop policies and we release white papers like ordinary think tanks do, but we also try to advance these principles in reality. We develop policy proposals and get legislatures to consider those, and then we go to court to litigate on behalf of economic and constitutional freedoms. My job, for instance, is I'm in charge of our legal team that sues the government at the state and federal level to advance constitutional principles of limited government.
But you guys, again, I always hate to think of you guys as a think tank because you really are an action tank. You're a doing machine. And, a lot of time people get caught up in policy and it's very dry, but you guys are doing things that affect us daily. In other words, you guys have done cases where you're defending the rights of people that have Airbnb, being allowed to actually have the freedom to rent their rooms out or rent their places out on Airbnb. The right to try. Let's talk about a couple of those cases that literally have affected every one of us.
So right to try, for instance, that's a bill that we developed a few years ago that got adopted in many states. More than 2/3 of the states adopted this piece of legislation, and then the federal government, Congress, enacted it into law a couple years ago. And what this law does is it says, if you're a terminally ill patient, you have a right to use medicine that the FDA has approved for safety but has not yet approved for full sale on the open market. So the FDA's policy of approving medicines is very slow, and it takes up several stages. The first step is a basic safety test, but the other tests that a medicine has to go through can take years before a medicine reaches the market. So what Right to Try said was, once a medicine has passed that first level of safety testing and the FDA starts giving it to people in clinical trials, everybody else has the right to use that medicine too if they're a terminally ill patient and they want to take a medicine that could possibly help alleviate their suffering or even save their lives.
That's a pretty tough battle to take on because you're actually taking on pharmaceutical companies, you're taking on the FDA, I'm assuming the AMA. Who all do you take on in a fight like that? And why do they try to keep you from being able to try? Even if you're at the end of your life, why do they try to keep you from trying?
Well, there's a lot of reasons. One thing is that federal regulators always think that they're doing the right thing, and they always want to be what they call better safe than sorry. The problem is that better safe than sorry can often be self-destructive, because what that ends up doing is denying people the opportunity to take medicines that could save their lives because the FDA thinks that it's too dangerous or even that it's safe but not going to be effective. And people should have that right to make their own decisions of whether to take a medicine or not. It shouldn't be up to federal bureaucrats. But it's also true that pharmaceutical companies really liked the older way of bureaucratic delay and so forth, because it tended to favor large-scale pharmaceutical companies instead of the small startup firms that often are the places where innovation and creativity comes from.
So what happens is these pharmaceutical companies kind of revel in the regulation because they can keep the small guy out. And that's a big thing. I think that's a huge part of this.
And, it's an important lesson, I think, just across the board. People often talk about free markets as if big business likes free markets and that free markets are bad for the little guy, when in fact the exact opposite is true. Big business typically hates free markets because they don't like competition. And so very often what you find is that big business gets the government to make it harder to compete against big business. Those of us who favor free markets and the reduction of regulatory burdens are saying, no, everybody should have the same right to compete. And if that means that big business ends up losing in that competition and gets replaced by a new company, that's good for consumers, good for Americans. That's the way it ought to be.
And that's really how the entire lobbyist business is built. I mean, the lobbyist money comes from huge companies, banks, insurance companies, pharmaceutical companies, telecommunications companies. They spend a lot of money to keep the little guy out. And speaking of the little guy, one of the big industries that's come across lately and has really built up over the last 4 or 5 years are people, actually individuals that own real estate. They own homes, whether it's their own personal home that they live in or it's a rental property. And they've turned to great revenue drivers like Airbnb and VRBO to be able to rent out rooms or properties that are rightfully theirs and that they have the right to rent out. Governments have come in and tried to stop them from doing that. You guys, to me, this is an example of Goldwater superheroism. Let's talk about what you did to right that wrong.
Yeah, so home sharing is a big project for the Institute. And as we were saying, government tends to intervene to try and obstruct this and bar people from deciding for themselves whether to allow somebody to stay the night in their own homes. And the reason it does it is often to favor big businesses. A lot of the time you find that hotels and tourism industry actors don't want that kind of competition from homeowners, and so they get the government to ban home sharing. And a lot of the time you find NIMBY groups, the not in my backyard crowd, that don't want to have strangers in their neighborhoods, and they also lobby the government to get restrictions on homeowners' private property rights. And so we've taken this project on at the Institute. And one of the first achievements that we had in Arizona was to enact a statewide law that says local governments are not allowed to impose blanket bans on home sharing. If a local government finds that a person is, misusing their property or creating a nuisance or causing some kind of problem in the neighborhood, sure, of course the government should protect people against nuisances and those sorts of things. But instead what we often find is that city officials are coming in and passing these blanket bans that just say nobody's ever allowed to engage in home sharing. You're never allowed to rent out your house for a day or a week or a month because we, the government, know best. And that's not the way it should be. Government power exists for specific purposes, and that is to protect people against harms and nuisances. It doesn't exist to just impose these kinds of one-size-fits-all prescriptions on how everybody is allowed to use their property. It's like if the government were to say, well, sometimes backyard barbecues or Super Bowl parties get noisy and rowdy, so we're going to ban all barbecues and all Super Bowl parties. That wouldn't make any sense, and the same rule should apply for home sharing.
There's no doubt about that. And with the internet and with all the easy ways for starting businesses online, obviously Airbnb was one of those. But it's got a whole new industry now of people who are what they call gig workers, or essentially it's freelance workers. The state of California, and a lot of lobbyists behind this, are trying to crush gig workers. And they did it through introducing this bill called AB5, Assembly Bill 5. This was passed in September of last year and enacted January 1st of this year in California. You guys are taking this thing on hardcore. If you don't mind, Tim, walk us through exactly what AB5 is, how it affects common people, and also why it even got introduced. This is one of the biggest business and income killing things, really, I think, ever.
Yeah, a lot of people were calling it the anti-Uber bill, because one of the biggest areas of freelance working is Uber drivers. And the reason why people, whether it be Uber drivers or anybody else, the reason why people choose to work freelance is because they like the flexibility and the opportunities that it provides. And of course, companies like freelance workers because hiring somebody on as a full-scale staff employee is very expensive and very time-consuming. It requires a lot of paperwork, and it costs a lot in terms of benefits and things like that. So a lot of the time, it serves both sides' best interest to do it as a freelance thing. But, of course, California decided that they know better than you and I do about how to run our lives. And so this law, AB5, says if a person is working as a freelancer under certain circumstances, and it's quite long in explaining the circumstances, then that person has to be an employee, is not allowed to be considered a freelancer. And this applies, among other things, to freelance journalists. Now, it applies to writers. It doesn't apply to broadcasters. And it applies to photographers, but it doesn't apply to motion picture photographers, so I think you're probably safe. But when it comes to a writer who writes a newspaper column, for example, this law actually contains a quota that says you're allowed to write 35 freelance newspaper columns before the government is going to force you to be classified as a full-scale employee with all of the expensive benefits and burdens that comes along with. And of course, the problem is a lot of newspapers, especially community newspapers, alt weeklies, places like that, they can't afford the extreme expense of bringing somebody on as a full-time staffer. So they rely heavily on freelance journalism. So that's why we say AB5 is really a job killer law for California. And it couldn't have come at a worse time than at a time when we're relying more than ever on freelance labor, such as delivery people to bring meals to your front door.
Right. And Tim, think about this. This week, the jobless number hit 40 million people. Now more than ever, freelancing is what it's going to be all about. I mean, you've got a lot of these folks. Not too many people know if they're going back to work, not going back to work, and they're going to have to start picking up these odd jobs here and there. In a state like California, how do they do it? How does someone get around that? Or what do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, the worst thing you can possibly do at a time when unemployment numbers are worse than they've been since the Great Depression is to pass a law that makes it more expensive and more difficult to give somebody a job. And that's what AB5 does. AB5 says even if the worker and the employer are both perfectly happy with the freelance situation, instead the government's going to step in like good big brother and tell us how to live our lives and what kind of choices we ought to make, and ensure that we have to either be a full-time employee or not employed at all. That doesn't benefit anybody.
Listen, Tim, this bill screwed a lot of people. I know a lot of people, journalists and otherwise, that have moved out of California, literally moved out of California because of this, and a lot of people planning on moving out of here for that, and of course, a lot of other reasons. I mean, California is not exactly paradise. What is the motivation for someone to write a bill like this and get it passed? And what's the motivation for people who, represent districts, legislative districts in the state of California who have hundreds and thousands of gig workers in their own districts? What's the motivation for them to back it?
Well, I think there's two things. The first one is just people often, when they hear, this law is going to protect workers, they don't think any more deeply than that, and they don't realize that these so-called protections are so expensive that as a result, employers are just not going to offer people jobs in the first place, and that's going to hurt a lot of these small communities that tend to be more served by freelance employers. I mentioned like newspapers and alt weeklies, for instance. Freelance journalists tend to be people who create stories that are, challenging the general narrative. They're taking on the big government, whereas big media companies, they tend to be a little more reluctant, a little more conservative when it comes to taking on issues like that. So this is going to have a distorting effect on freedom of speech. So a lot of the time people don't think about the consequences of these policies. They just hear a term like, oh, this is going to protect workers, and they don't realize that it means protecting them out of jobs. But the second thing is about the politicians. A lot of the time, this is being led by labor unions who want to use the government to prohibit competition against them. Just like we were saying about big corporations, they like to use government to block competition. So do labor unions. And one of the ways that labor unions do that is to make it too expensive to hire non-union labor. And the way they do that is by passing laws that makes it more difficult for employers and workers to decide for themselves on the terms of employment. And that way, they price non-union labor out of the market by government command, and that forces employers then to resort to the unions.
Well, it's interesting you say that because, there were people here in the state of California who thought, hey, this sounds like something really good. I'll get all the benefits and still kind of be that part-time person until they got cut. Once the thing actually passed and people were staring the gun barrel, right down the gun barrel, they lost their jobs. They lost their part-time gigs. And that's a lot of people. I've had a lot of people talk about that. So they were sold an absolute bill of goods and really got hoodwinked in the end.
Oh, unfortunately, that's what you get with one-party rule, which is certainly what you have in California. Incidentally, since I don't live in California, let me say, we welcome all of you hardworking people who would like to earn an honest living for yourselves and your families. You are welcome to move to the Grand Canyon State and help us build a healthy economy instead.
Tim, I got to tell you, I can't get out of this place fast enough. I'm not kidding you. Of course, I was over in Arizona a couple of months ago hanging with some of your guys, was in Nashville a couple of weeks ago. It literally felt like getting out of prison. California is just turned into one of the biggest shitholes known to man, both from a policy standpoint and from an infrastructure standpoint, as you know. It's getting kind of crazy here.
I'm a native Californian myself. And, if you can stand the weather, Arizona is a great refuge for you.
Oh, Arizona is fantastic. So this is AB5 we're talking about in California Assembly Bill AB5. Let's talk about on a national level, because Adam Schiff and several other people have started proposing this. I don't know where it is in process yet, but they're actually talking about putting this type of thing out nationally. What's going on with that?
It would be a disaster if such a policy were to be passed, an economic disaster that would transform what we're now going through in terms of a severe economic downturn into a genuine decade-long depression, such as we had in the 1930s. In 1929, when the stock market crashed and the economy went into a nosedive, that sort of thing happens. It was severe, it was painful, but the economy could easily have recovered from that. But in order to do that, both the businesses and the workers would have had to decide for themselves how to go about doing so. Instead, what happened was the government came in and in a series of policies adopted restrictions on economic freedom that prohibited workers from leaving one job and going to another, prohibited employers from terminating employees if they needed to, taxed away the money that businesses needed for investment and expansion, restricted how businesses could produce and what they could charge and things like that. And as a result, what would have been just a painful economic downturn in 1929 turned into a generation-defining catastrophe that we know as the Great Depression. And the government could easily do the same thing today if it repeats the mistakes that it made in the 1930s.
So, Tim, obviously, AB5, absolute, total disaster. Again, it's killing California, a state that was already in shambles. What do we do about a bill like AB5, something like that being passed? How do you fight back?
Well, right now there's a lawsuit that's pending in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals challenging the constitutionality of AB5, specifically for journalists, because I mentioned that 35-item quota. Well, that 35-item quota only applies to stories that, quote, pertain to a topic, end quote. And so what that means is that, for example, if you're a poet and you submit 35 poems to a magazine, that's okay. But if you're a newspaper writer and you write 35 articles about something, that's not okay. Well, that violates the First Amendment, and that's the issue that's currently pending in the Court of Appeals. That lawsuit has been brought by our friends at the Pacific Legal Foundation, which is another nonprofit litigation organization similar to Goldwater that's headquartered in Sacramento. So Goldwater, and I used to work at Pacific Legal Foundation myself. So the Goldwater Institute and Pacific Legal Foundation work together on a lot of cases of this sort. So that's what's going on right now in the courts. But honestly, the bottom line is that as a long-term matter, the only solution to problems like this is for people to learn about how economics works and to recognize and respect the fact that workers should have the right to decide for themselves whether or not to take jobs and what terms of employment they're willing to accept. It's not the role of the government to come in and act like it's, a protective father that exists to tell us what's best for ourselves. That's the real fallacy at issue. And once people grasp that, I think that they'll demand policies that respect those rights.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, too, that, again, they sell these bill of goods to the people as one thing, then they get passed, they get enacted, and it has just the opposite effect like you've seen here with AB5, and there's a lot of backlash. Listen, Tim, it's great having you with us from the Goldwater Institute. If there was ever an organization that stands for truth, justice, and the American way, it is the Goldwater Institute. Tim, how do people get a hold of you, and how do people support you?
You can check out our blog at In Defense of Liberty, all one word, indefenseofliberty.blog, to keep an eye on all the stuff that we're doing. Or just go to Google and look for Goldwater Institute. And we are supported by almost entirely by donations from people who agree with the kind of work we do. So if your viewers approve the kind of work that we're doing and want us to do more, please drop us a couple bucks and we'll make liberty together.
And let me tell you, Goldwater Institute is totally nonpartisan. Matter of fact, I love how you guys take up for the little guy, which a lot of times those people tend to be a little bit left. But you take up for the little guy always, and I really, really appreciate it. Tim Sandefur, great to have you with us. God bless. Have a great weekend. Again, go to the Goldwater Institute, check it out, and support.